A very warm welcome to all of you. In today's lecture, we are going to cover structure and agency in migration studies. Now, you all might be familiar with structure and agency in social theory, or you may have done it as a part of any other disciplinary training. Today, we are going to specifically look at it in the context of migration. So, the broad readings for this lecture are Bakewell's paper, Bakewell's 2010 paper, and we are also going to talk about Giddens' theory of structuration, and we will also look at De Haas's working paper and how structure and agency play out in migration studies. Right. So, you know the relationship between structure and agency is complex. It's persisted for decades and it keeps coming up, right? So, you have the macro and you have the micro. You have the individual and you have the society. So, like we saw the units of analysis, the units of analysis are can be seen as in a continuum, and structure and agency can also be imagined in that framework. The other thing is that in migration studies, what's even more important is that we rely a lot on the agency of individual migrants and also non-migrants to understand broad processes of social change. And so therefore, we have some theories which lean towards structuralism, and then there are other theories that lean towards functionalism. So then how is it that we can get some middle ground? And so for instance, you know, theories of the neoclassical theories of new economics of migration. These are largely theories, these are functionalist theories. They're largely looking at migration from the lens of the individual, from the lens of the household, looking at the agency of the individual in migration and so on. Whereas other theories like say modernization theory or historical structuralist theories or world system theory, these are structuralist theories. These are looking and explaining migration largely through structural perspectives, right? And so therefore, some approaches lean towards structuralism, other approaches lean towards functionalism, and Giddens' structuration theory that we'll go through gives us some middle ground. Now, Bakewell in his paper is quite critical of the structuration theory, and he discusses the problems in understanding the structure agency debate. So, we have several views on the structuration theory, and Bakewell is critical of the structuration theory, and he says that this whole problem of structure and agency, he calls it the structure agency impasse. He says is not really useful in understanding migration, whereas other perspectives are far more positive about the structuration theory, and we'll go through them as we move along in the course. The other thing Bakewell says is that this problem of structure and agency is a major stumbling block for the development of any kind of theory in migration. So, for the development of a coherent theory, for the development of an integrated theory, this structure and agency are a big stumbling block in developing the theory. So, what should really be components of a good migration theory? What is it that a good theoretical account of migration should include? So, Massey et al. In their seminal paper argue that a good theoretical account of migration should have four main elements. The first is the treatment of structural forces in the area of origin. The second is the treatment of structural forces in the area of destination. The third is, of course, that we need to consider the motivations, goals and aspirations of people who migrate, right? So, then this is largely looking at individual agency and so on. And the last element is an analysis of social and economic structures that are formed to connect areas of outward and inward migration. So, these are the broad four areas which Massey et al. Argue are necessary for a good theoretical account of migration. You can also see how these four areas actually encompass structure and agency in different ways. And the other thing that they do, and which is not surprising, is that they argue that individual-based theories, atomistic theories that deny any kind of importance to structure are not really very useful. So, Massey et al. Are skeptical of theories which do not focus on the structure, focus too much on atomistic, on the atomistic individual. And then at the same time, they also argue that they're skeptical of theories that are structuralist only, right? So, structural theories that deny agency to individual, those are also problematic in migration. So, therefore, then what emerges is that both structure and agency needs to be balanced in some way in theory making and for theories to be empirically valid. Now, how is structure and agency seen in social theory, right? So, what do we mean by structure and agency? So, let's spend some time talking about agency first. So, now an agency is something which is an attribute of all members of society, right? And so, the idea is that the agency can be attributed to individuals, and agency here refers to the capacity of social actors to reflect on their position, devise strategies, take action and achieve their desires. Now, for some, the emphasis on action is sufficient, right? So, agency need not be any more than the simple individualism of autonomous actors who are exercising their power over the world and beyond, right? And so, you can see very well that this is a very, very individual oriented conceptualization of agency. Now, what Bakewell argues is that, he sort of rejects such individualist orientations, and he says that, we need to understand agency. Agency is more than the sum of, or agency is more than the aggregate of individuals, right? And instead, we need to understand agency as something which is relational, right? Agency has a relational property. So, people come together in complicated arrangements of social relations, they create organizations, they create patterns of behavior, and therefore, agency is much more than the sum of parts, right? So, then therefore, Bakewell argues to be an agent, it means to be capable of exerting some degree of control over social relations in which one is enmeshed, and therefore, in turn, this implies the ability to transform those social relations to some degree. So, therefore, agency is more than the sum of parts, and agency is something that we need to also see in a relational manner rather than only in an individualistic manner, right? And as I mentioned earlier, there are certain theories in migration like neoclassical theory, new economics of labor migration. These are largely rooted in individualistic frameworks, but then we can also see, by the time we come to the new economics of labor migration, we can see how relational views are also very important in understanding individual agency. So, now let's move from agency to structure. So, what Bakewell asks is structure the sum of parts? So, is structure the sum of agency? And so, here he uses the definition of Scott and Marshall, and so structure is defined as something which is concerned with any recurring pattern of social behavior, or more specifically to the ordered interrelationship between different elements of a social system or society, right? So, therefore, then it's very evident that structure is much more than the sum of parts. So, in that sense, this definition is inadequate. But then Bakewell also argues that it's very hard to pin structure down to a formal definition, right? So, we need to look at structure as a metaphor, and when we look at structure as a metaphor, so structure operates in social scientific discourse as a powerful metonymic device. What do we mean by metonymic? Something that's all encompassing. So, structure operates in social scientific discourse as a powerful metonymic, that's all encompassing device, identifying some part of a complex social reality as explaining the whole. It's a word to conjure in the social sciences. In fact, structure is less a precise concept than a kind of founding epistemic metaphor for social scientific and scientific discourse, right? So, the idea is that structure is all encompassing, and structure is something which really in many ways is a foundation of a scientific discourse, right? Now, what is the problem with using structure as a metaphor? When we use structure as a metaphor, then there's a tendency for reification. Now, what do we mean by this? So, a tendency for reification means that we're making it more concrete, right? So you can look at structure in an abstract manner, but when you reify it, it sort of becomes more and more concrete. And when we do that, then structure itself becomes rigid. Then structure therefore becomes something which is unmutable, unchangeable, and so on. And then when that happens, then it's beyond human agency. And so the idea is that structures also change, right? And if we have such huge connotations of stability in a structure, then how do we understand social change, right? So then therefore there are problems of using structure as a metaphor as well. We now come to Giddens' theory of structuration. So, Bakewell argues that Giddens' theory of structuration is an elegant compromise, and it has an intuitive appeal for many social scientists. And so let's go to the theory. And so what Giddens is really arguing is that structure has a dual nature. So structure has both the medium and outcome of social practices that they recursively organize, right? So structure has a dual nature, both the medium and the outcome of the social practices that they recursively organize. Now, structure not only shapes social practice, but it then is also reproduced and transformed by social practice. So, therefore, social structures are seen not just as constraints on individual actors, but also enabling their action. So, you see the interplay between structure and agency here, and therefore, social actors are self-aware in the sense of continual monitoring of their effects, both intended and unintended, of action and the modification of their behavior accordingly. So, while their action may be constrained, people's agency ensure that they always have some degrees of freedom, some room to maneuver. So, the idea is no matter how hard the structure, individual agency is always important, and that's structuration. So, now the duality of structure ensures that structure is not slavishly replicated, but it is reproduced. It only has existence insofar as it's instantiated in social practice. And apart from practice, it only has a virtual existence, the potential to shape practice at the time of action. So, what Giddens is really arguing is to say that structure is a virtual order of transformative relations means that social systems as reproduced social practices do not have structures, but rather they exhibit structural properties, and that structure exists as time-space presence only in its instantiation in such practice and as memory traces orienting the conduct of knowledgeable human agents. So, therefore, the process of structuration always leaves some room for social transformation, as structures are the result of messy interactions of social actors struggling, negotiating, and at times guessing in order to further their interests. Now, what Bakewell then argues is that there are problems. Now, what are the problems with structuration? So, now according to Bakewell, agency is hyperactive, right? So, what he's saying is that structuration always has the option to be transformative, and at certain points actors can elect to act in a different way, whether to bring about change or to maintain status quo and so on. And then he's coming to his more fundamental problem. He's saying if you are unable to separate agency and structure, And so therefore, then it's impossible to explore the relationship between agency and structure. And therefore, then Bakewell argues that it has little to offer to empirical research. So therefore, what Bakewell is also arguing is that we must acknowledge that there is an analytical dualism between structure and agency, and this analytical dualism recognizes that they operate over different time periods. And so what implications does this have for migration research? So Bakewell says, therefore, we need to look at more pluralist paradigms, we need to use mixed methods, and we need to understand migration in fundamentally more ways than just structure and agency because of the limitations of this framework. Now, there are others who've taken a more positive approach on structuration. So, Moravska in King's paper has argued that agency can be seen as the everyday engagement of individuals with different structural environments, which through the interplay of habit, imagination and judgment both reproduces and transforms those structures in interactive response to the problems posed by challenging situations. In this definition, taking on work of previous authors, then structuration is particularly suited to the interpretation of migration, which take place between different environments, which impel migration to confront new structures and circumstances which they have to accept and adapt to, or perhaps even change. Now, once we interpret migration in this framework, right, then migrants' activities are neither deterministically manipulated products of structures, nor are they simply agency volition, right. And so, what you see is this is a middle ground. Rather, they are the ongoing and constantly changing outcomes of time and place, specific context, and of the interaction between structures and agentic action. So, the idea is that we look at structure, we look at agency, and structuration just very simply means that in an everyday framework, agency can also, the sum of agencies can affect structures, and then structures themselves change over time, right. And so therefore, and you know, empirically, it's argued that the amount of agentic power individuals can deploy depends on their socio-cultural resources and also the influence of various structural elements which vary spatially and temporally, right. And this is really very, very important, right. Everyone doesn't have the same ability to exert their agency, right. How you're able to exert your agency matters on your human capital, matters on your social capital, and also on structures, right. This last point about structures is actually very, very important, right. So, for instance, if we want to think of several examples of structural elements, the very first thing can be economic conditions, right. If the economy is stagnant, then it will not be very conducive for migration, right. And no matter how much agency an individual has, no matter how much agency a worker has, if a migrant is operating in the context of a stagnant economy, they're going to be constrained in surpassing that hurdle, right. Then similarly, you have, the nature of the labor market matters, the degree of regulation in migration matters, the policies towards openness or restrictiveness towards migration matter, and of course, the civic policies of political pluralism or exclusiveness in the host society also matter. So, we can really see then, in the context of migration, agency is a function of individual socio-cultural resources, but also how much agency an individual is able to deploy is a function of structural elements, right. So, then therefore, Dehas in his working paper that we've been covering through the course argues that structures therefore can be constraining, structures can be enabling, and so whether they're political structures, whether they're economic structures, whether they're institutional structures, social or cultural structures, they can be constraining or enabling. And so when we come to structuration, they are arguing that structural constraints do matter. Structural constraints matter very much in the daily struggle for most people, and they also severely limit their capability to overcome the situation of poverty or underdevelopment and so on. However, on the other hand, neoclassical and developmentalist perspectives on migration and development, they tend to underestimate these structural constraints, right? Whatever perspectives focus on agency or focus entirely on agency, therefore by logic underestimate structural constraints, right? And at the same time, agency, which is limited, but real capacity of individuals to overcome constraints and potentially reshape the structural context. But at the same time, agency is also very important. The limited but real capacity of individuals to overcome constraints and potentially reshape the structural context, right? So, now if we look at this empirically, we know empirically that the poorest don't migrate, right? There's enough empirical data, studies across the world showing that those who are the poorest, which is they have very limited limited capacities to migrate. It's true that the poor migrate, and migration is pretty high among the poor in various contexts, in various empirical contexts, but typically migration tends to be low among the poorest. However, even among the poorest people migrate, right? And a lot of this migration can be attributed to individual agency. But the overall point is that the structures do matter, right? And how is it that structure and agency interplay with one another? That is a fundamental point of the structuration theory. So with this, we come to the end of this lecture. The references used are Bakewell's paper on structure and agency in migration theory, and Giddens' seminal work on structuration theory. And we've also referred to Russell King's and Hindehas's theoretical papers that we have been drawing on in the course of this course. Thank you very much. I hope you found this lecture useful.